what's useful, but I actually have a lot to say about this, and that gets exciting to me because then I feel really useful, and I think I have something unique to say that I haven't heard. In some ways, everything I'm saying, there's nothing unique about it, right? Like in a way, I can't say anything that's not already been said in some form or fashion, and in a way, like every time I say it, it's totally fresh, and we're making it in conjunction with y'all and your questions and me and my life experience. So I think so there's this question on, parts. Like you hear people a lot of times in circles, a lot of times in like internal family systems or like constellation therapy that refer to like these kind of various parts of a person's psyche, right? Parts. And they'll be like, oh, there's just a very natural way that sometimes we'll say like, there's a part of me that feels this and a part of me that feels that, right? So I think there's something really cool about this. Like it's really, there's an awakening of complexity and multiplicity in our self relationship that happens when we start to refer to ourselves as, like Walt Whitman said, do I contradict myself? Yes, I contain multitudes. So there's something about the kind of a multiplicity where, most of us grow up, with one sense of who we are. And of course, there's multiple personality disorders and things like this that are like dysfunctional versions of parts. But for most of us, like we kind of have a coherent sense of self. We're like, this is who I am. And maybe it goes along traditional identity lines. I'm male, I'm white, I'm American, I'm Texan. I, was born in 86, year of the tiger, I think. Anyway, you get the point. There's like these different, like, these different identity pieces. I'm like, they're all kind of external things that define me, but I'm like one thing. And so that's, I don't know. So I think there's actually a developmental sequence that parts is part of. So we're like, of self identity. So we eventually, most of us as adults, we get to the point where we're like, we're kind of a differentiated, coherent self, right? We're no longer defined by like all of our relationships with everyone else and all of our roles. We're able to like kind of choose things in a kind of coherent self. So we're just going to call that coherent self. But then, lo and behold, we start doing therapy or introspecting more, or we have enough success and well-being, and we start to recognize, holy shit, like this coherent thing that I thought I was is not as coherent as I thought it was, right? Maybe we recognize it through circling. We show up to circling to try to get better communication, and then we're like, holy shit, like, wow, I'm like a bunch of contradictions. And so then this is where we start to have these parts, and or what I call multitudes. There's I've heard someone call it kind of an interior kind of choir. And this is a really big awakening for a lot of people. And there's a lot of exploration that you can do to just recognize, like, yeah, there's different parts of me, and they all try to grab the microphone if we're in a choir. Or sometimes you'll say, people will talk about like, they keep trying to grab the steering wheel, and like drive the car. And in some ways, these are all just ways of making sense of experience, of subjectivity. And so from that point of view, we can divide the number of parts literally infinitely. You could spend the rest of your life kind of dividing and subdividing parts. And it probably at a certain point would stop being useful. But I think what most people, there's certain generalities, like people will often talk about the parent and the child, for example, which I don't know where it goes back to, who first kind of came up with that language. I know it comes up in transactional analysis. People will often talk about protectors and different kind of parts like that. You can recognize kind of introjected voices of your dad or your mom or different mentors and teachers and all that kind of stuff. But one thing that I notice is that most of the time when people kind of hit this stage, which is a huge leap forward in self-awareness, they also hold these parts as kind of equal. So it really is like a choir. Like maybe one of them will get a solo, but for the most part, it's like, oh, there's just all these parts in me. And there's two things I think that are really interesting about that are missing. One, who and what is the self that's aware of the parts, that's making choices, that's identifying them? And so some people are really savvy to this, and they'll just name that as another part. Oh, that's the manager, that's the watcher. But actually, I think if you look at your experience, you'll notice, and you guys, we can all do this right now, right? Like there's something active. Maybe it's your student, the learner part. Maybe it's the rebel. Like whatever he says, I'm gonna fucking disagree with it because I'm my own person, you know. It doesn't matter. There's some part that's active, and then there's something that's aware of that. And now that we're bringing attention to it, it's kind of like noticing it. Is it equal? Is it another part? Maybe, I don't know. I think there's something different in me that is a kind of wider witnessing awareness that actually is kind of somewhat aloof or detached from the parts. And it may engage a kind of manager that can then choose parts, but it seems like from this spaciousness, this witnessing awareness, I often have choice whether to engage. It's almost like the awareness itself. I don't know if I don't really know actually. I'm looking right now. It seems like the awareness kind of pauses the kind of habitual activity of a part, if we're going to use that language. And then in that spaciousness, I suddenly have choice. I don't know where the choice comes from. But so I think that's really interesting. But the other thing is that, so I think that's not equal. But the other thing is that in my actual experience, and I think in y'all's experience too, you'll notice these parts aren't equal. Not only are they not equal in the sense that they, certain voices in you, certain parts in you like get more attention and less attention. Some are better at getting the microphone and some are worse. Some have more charge, more history, more wounding, more demands, and others are just more okay. Some are more preferential, some are less. Some are more honest, more aligned with your purpose. And some are more dishonest. Some lack integrity. Some are more fragmented or dissociated, right? So the reality is that, like, not only do I have preferences, somehow my body-mind system prefers certain energies over other energies. But I think everyone agrees, like some are, yeah, more honest. There's a kind of ranked preferential awareness of better and worse amongst these parts, and healthier and less healthier in even individual energies. And I think furthermore, there's groupings. So sometimes I'll encourage people to move from a kind of multitude choir perspective to more of an orchestra, because orchestras have sections and there's first and second chairs, right? So instead of it being like, you know, these are all just kind of equal in the circle, they're all just equal parts. It's more like, no, this is the woodwinds and this is first chair. And so first chair in the woodwinds here is like my, my spiritual parts. So for me, you know, there's like, maybe first chair is spacious awareness, you know, and then second is the kind of like loving attention or something. I don't know. I'm just making stuff up, right? And then there's another section here, which is like my egocentric stuff. And for me, you know, like anger is like fifth chair. So it doesn't often get much directing capacity in the symphony that I'm playing in any given moment, the symphony of my being. Does that make sense? How like this is one kind of added complexity to the parts framework that I think is really important, because otherwise what happens is we basically don't have any movement forward, and we end up continuously self-referentially, almost narcissistically working on parts over and over and over again. And we're always, oh, I need to integrate this. But actually, maybe you don't need to integrate this. Maybe it's fifth chair, and maybe you want to kick it out of the orchestra. Just because it's in your experience doesn't mean that it's should be there. You want it there. And in circling, of course, we do this in a really kind of paradoxical way. We start by honoring its presence, which I think is, in some ways, it's paradoxical. And in some ways, it's the only way. You can't kick somebody out of the orchestra without admitting that they're there first. Right? Like, we can all ignore that person keeps playing wrong notes, and it's not going to help the symphony sound beautiful or elegant or do what we want to do. We have to be like, okay, look, Todd, like, everyone stop, and like, Todd, you keep fucking up the notes. You need to get in line, or we're going to ask you to leave. And so in circling, we do that by being like, hey, this belief that you're not enough, Jordan, which I'm calling Todd in this case, the not enoughness is named Todd. Hey, Todd, you keep getting in the way of truth and love and honesty and elegance and grace and forgiveness and generosity and kindness and gratitude and compassion. And I know that you're here to help support those things. So we need to get you on board in a way that is actually helpful, or let you go. And in circling, we do that with each other by honoring, like, first of all, we honor that that's just only an individual's choice. It's not, like, I may want to get rid of David's Todd, and I just don't get to. I can say, hey, I'm not going to engage with your Todd. I'm sorry to all the Todds out there.
Well, I want to name, this is perfectly lined up with Inside Out, right? Yes. Where Joy is talking to Sadness, like, hey, Sadness, you're messing everything up. Stay inside this circle and don't touch anything, right? And there's something really beautiful about that, especially given what the gift that sadness brings when actually encountered, right?
Right. Well, here's another interesting thing. I know, like, Inside Out is fucking brilliant and very complex. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's this movie where it's really worth seeing. It's like a Pixar movie, and David can speak to it even more powerfully. It's, I think, one of your favorites. And they basically have characters of the emotions: anger, joy, sadness, disgust, and surprise. Is it, or
fear?
Fear. That's right, fear. And it's just in the beautiful Pixar way, it's like this character outside going through life, but you kind of see what happens when, like, joy essentially is trying to spiritual bypass everything the whole time, and like the cost of that. It's really brilliant. And it's kind of interesting because, like, I always want to be like, wait, there's this microcosm of, like, the Inside Out emotions inside each of the Inside Out characters, like joy has these characters inside of joy, and like and they kind of introduce some of that complexity at the end where they show, like, other people's insides and how, like, fear drives this guy and anger drives that gal and like that sort of thing. So it's really good. But yeah, where were we? There's a good question. Let me get the quotes here.
And I have a question too.
Yeah. So we got go.
Well, it relates to what you were saying. The analogy of Inside Out and a band, which is ironic, like, because my mom she was a band teacher, right? So at what point is there a distinction between the observer, who's just the band conductor, but never a part of the band? Like, they're not a student, they're like something other than, and they're not like living the experience of the band. And then, like, when are they, like, what does it look like to identify yourself in that and metaphor, in terms of the observer, like an external observer, like the divine voice or whatever, like I had posted in the chat, versus when you're not being present, you're just disassociating by being an observer, like you're the band conductor, but you're not like actually feeling anything.
So there's a couple questions in that, right? There's a question of, like, dissociation. There's a question of the connection between the kind of separate and divine, or the individual, let's say, and divine observers.
Mm-hmm.
And let's get to these, but not quite yet. But I do want to say one thing, which is that I think that these are all of these that I'm naming, like the coherent self, a multitude choir, an orchestra. These are basically like framings of experience that we get to choose. These are constructs, self-constructs, but we'll call them, we already have self-identities, so we're just going to call them constructs. Which, what I mean by that is that there's a kind of, there's an infinity of experience. And you guys might have experienced this, or you might experience it right now, where you kind of recognize that you're making choices in every moment through the way that you divide up experience, usually through language. So if you say this is a computer, you're kind of separating it arbitrarily from everything else, which you could be like, oh, this isn't a computer. This is the result of like 200,000 years of humanity trying to like create tools. Or you could say this is an interactive effect between the power plant and Apple computers, and what, you know, like there's all these ways you could say this is a blink in the pan of the universe. You could say this is an extension of my being. All these things are choices about this infinity, and that we're just looking at one supposed object that is like out there. And so we're making these kind of constructions of experience to help us navigate reality. And I don't really understand how that happens or what's really going on, but it seems to me that there's some sense in which we co-enact experience with our construction of it and a kind of isness that's out there. So there is energy, there is computer, there is atoms. You know, we're not denying the isness of the external world. We're actually in conjunction with it, or in communion, or in co-creation of it. So it's the same with with the self-identity. I'm not here to deny the sense of subjectivity that feels separate from other subjectivities. Personally, I hold it as like the divine. We talked about this before when we talked about Eros. It's like the divine consciousness. You can almost think of it as an underground river, an aquifer. And it kind of sprouts up in little springs. And so the spring is an individual. The spring is a Nat. Another spring is a David. Another one is a Christina. Another one is a Jordan. It's the same water that flows through, but each spring is very different and very unique. But in a way, all a spring is the outpouring of that divine water. It's the release of it. So, you know, from that metaphor, Christine, I think the question is kind of like, well, what about the individual versus the divine observer? When the spring kind of recognizes, oh, my I amness is not defined by these particular grouping of rocks that I spurt through or the flowers that I water, but that's part of it. But I'm at least as defined by the water that's spurting through me. That's what makes me a spring and not just random outcroppings. That's actually that spring has a kind of awakening to its own waterness. That's the observer. Oh, you know, I'm not just this rock. I'm not just this body. I'm not the effects I do in the world. I'm this divinity. I'm this consciousness that's coming through. And eventually I might recognize that I'm not actually separate from that aquifer, from that underground river. I'm the result of it. And I'm constantly being fed by it, as is everyone else. That doesn't diminish my individuality, right? Recognizing that Xenia is fed by the same spring of divine consciousness doesn't reduce her uniqueness. It honors it, but it also includes her and I in this larger picture. And I think it's really important, as a side note, to not reduce the uniqueness of the individuality, because I think that makes it incredibly difficult to actually wake up to the wider connection we have to being, to life, to flow, to infinity. Because it feels like a great threat, especially here in the West. It may be that if we grew up elsewhere in other times, it would be it would be useful to talk about like, oh yeah, you're going to kill the self and you're going to kill the ego or something. Because we may have really had too strong of egos or something, I don't know. But personally, I think we're, at least in Texas, say, for example, we have such a strong culture of individuality that it's just an unnecessary stumbling block on the path to recognizing the truth of our larger interconnectivity. We don't need that frame of ego dying to wake up to that we're so much larger. And then once we wake up to it, it's very easy to just be like, oh yeah, you are very unique, and your uniqueness is so small that you don't need to hold on to it. And in any given moment that you're contracted and trying to reify yourself, getting defensive, like in a circle, for example, or needing to prove your point, needing to fix someone else, needing to leave because you're uncomfortable or change others so that you can whatever, needing to grow, needing to understand this theory better, needing to whatever it is, like you can recognize those, and knowing that you're part of this larger stream, this larger flow, you can hold them in a much greater compassion, much greater loving embrace, and let them go. Oh, I don't need to hold on to this grievance, for example. Oh, I don't need to prove them spiritual by not standing for a boundary that I think is important. In other words, I can say no, and it's no big deal. So that's one interesting thing with these parts. There's more. I want to take us to another place, because I think this orchestra thing is very, very helpful and a very good way of understanding, but it doesn't include this aquifer metaphor, right? And even the aquifer metaphor, I don't know where to put the aquifer. We're just going to write aquifer here. And we're just going to erase that because it's kind of confusing. Yeah, we'll come back to the aquifer. One of the things I think that both the parts frame can be limiting in is that it typically turns our attention only into this particular sprout, like this particular outpouring, spring of the river. And actually, when I look at experience, and I think circling does this so very well, I find that I am so much more than the things happening in here. And that the things happening in here are almost always in direct connection with everything else out here, you know? So you could think of that as a mirror, like the world is mirroring my choices. And so there's this kind of interconnectivity with the whole of being and all of my relationships. It's like, man, why did I, face the same type of aggressive male, 4 days in a row in totally different situations? Well, because like somewhere deep inside of me, I felt I needed to learn something about that. I needed to integrate that or say no to that or whatever. It's like, and so I can feel the universe being in tandem with me or helping me, because the universe is me and I'm the universe. There's this kind of non-separation. So you could think of it that way, or you don't have to buy into that. You could just notice more that like, we're making each other up right now. The way that Nat is focused, the questions that Christina asks, the way that I speak is impacting all of our mutual experiences, both as a collective and as individuals. And so there's this sense in which we're always unique, autonomous individual, and we're always the result or the product of interactions in every moment with everything, with our past, with our future, with others. So it's very hard to remember this and recognize like our interconnectivity or with this kind of metaphor. So it's almost like we'd have to include that there are like two orchestras. Or like, so you've got the blue orchestra and you've got the red orchestra, and then and they're playing notes you know. And then these notes are hitting this orchestra in all these different ways, all the different parts, all the different players. And then those guys, and gals, you know, guys in the gender neutral sense that I do because I'm Texan, they're like, you know, reverberating back different notes, you know, harmonics and harmony and disharmony. And then those reverberations then come back and reverberate back. And then it's this kind of endless, infinite feedback loop, right? So that what these actually are is this thing, as much as it is the individual pieces inside of this thing. Sometimes I've talked about it in the past as a tunnel, where you're not so much a thing that then gets connected to another thing, but rather you're the result, you're the entrance to a tunnel. And that the tunnel is this relationship. That's the vast majority of the isness, the stuff, the matter of being is the between. And you're actually very unique. The entrance is very different from the exit. You're a very unique negative space in a way. So I want to take this one step further when we talk about, so yeah, this is great. What do we do though when we feel like there's parts inside of us? Because we all feel that, right? How do we include the orchestra, the multitudes, the coherent self in our experience when we're like, oh yeah, part of me is angry and part of me feels forgiveness. And what I'd like to suggest, a framing that kind of works for me, is almost like if you imagine that this is like, now we're dealing with like a 3-dimensional aquifer, or like a lake, an aquifer lake, instead of like a stream. Okay, so this is the part. Give me a part, Christina. What's a part that you recognize in you?
Part I recognize in me is protective mother.
Protective mother. Okay, so green equals protective mother. And so what I like to do is think of parts, rather than them being like little guys inside of me that separate me, is rather that they're little outpourings of universal energy. So here's Christina. And here's Jordan. And here's David. And we all have expressions of the protective mother. Maybe for me, it's not that strong. You know, my protective mother doesn't come up that much. But it's pretty strong for David. Okay, David, give me an energy. What's a part? Sorry, that you might recognize?
My sense of wonder.
Wonder, perfect, yeah. So, oops, we're not gonna have red. Oh, we need red. It's all the way on the other side though. We're not gonna have the red. The red marker's done, guys, sorry. So we have wonder. And so David's got a lot of wonder. Maybe I don't have much wonder either, you know, but Christina's got a lot of wonder. So we got wonder energy here. And so rather than it being a part of David, it's wonder. It's his access to a kind of universal wonder energy that exists, I don't know, out there, you could say, or in the Akashic records, or in the morphogenetic field, if you're more of a Rupert Sheldrake guy. There's all these storehouse consciousness. There's all these interesting ways to think about it. But nevertheless, let's get one more. I wish we had the red. But maybe there's a part of wishing we had the red, you know, wishing for life to be other than it is, okay? So we've got, apparently right now, I've got a lot of wishing life to be other than it is. Christina's got basically none. David's also got basically none. This is wishing life to be different. So then, whereas the kind of like orchestra is like, oh, I'm just a random collection of all these parts. What this is saying is like, what I define me as, the uniqueness of Jordan, is just this unique collection of universal energies expressing in this way in this moment. You know, so it's like an access point to all of these universal energies. And Christina is a different access point to these universal energies. I think this is a really interesting way to use parts or to think about parts. Because, and what I end up finding myself doing, sometimes I just use parts and it's fine. And it's a good way to talk about it. Especially because my best other alternative is to say energies, and that can like totally give people a woo vibe. And so I'm like, I don't know what else to say. I haven't come up with the good alternatives. But when it's fine for me to be super woo, I'll say, yeah, like there's a kind of energy of anger in me. And I hold it as both mine, my unique, this is a very different expression of wonder than this one. And it's part of the universal. So I'm like, it is my anger. It exists in the Jordan access to life experience. And yet it's also part of this larger universal experience that's part of humanness. And one of the things I think this does for me is it allows me an incredible amount of compassion. It opens me to really want to welcome and love the wholeness of human experience in me. And I can see that if I can find if I'm with somebody, say, for example, in a circle or out of a circle, it's judging the hell out of me, let's say. And if I can find it, I'm like, yeah, I've got something in me that does that. It judges the hell out of people. It's probably doing it right now with this person that's judging me. And I can find my access to that universal energy. I can suddenly have a much more compassionate response to them. And I still may say no to it. So it's not fair, or I have certain requirements that you have to be able to meet me halfway in this conversation. But I'm going to do it with so little reactivity. Christine, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm here and there.
Here and there.
Yeah.
Jordan, I witnessed a conversation recently where at the outset, it was acknowledged that the advice was, the person holding the interview said, I've been advised by many people not to talk to you. People I trust who said, I should not be talking to you. And I want to check and just see how we are with each other. And one of the things that the guy he was interviewing said at one point was, he likes to trigger liberals or shame liberals. And it was interesting because it's almost impossible to hear that from a compassionate place, but the interviewer heard it from a place of, you care a lot about the way that people show up to life.
Mm.
And you don't think you should give a pass to people who don't hold this with the same degree of rigor that you do. Mm. And you want them to see what that is. And it's something, you could feel the emotionality move through that. It was more so even than the person felt himself. There may have been something petty in it at first, but in the being seen that way, it was like, yeah, I care. It's a really potent way of listening, not from a place of trying to find the nicest way to listen, but actually seeing how deeply he cared. And what you're saying here about the parts and the compassion for hearing, what's important there? Which energy is coming through you so loudly that it's a very distinct shape, right?
Right, and that sounds like amazing circling. And there's a certain sense in which you're choosing the construct or the frame or the meaning making over an experience that you don't have choice over. What's happening out there, he's shaming liberals or whatever, the interviewee. And yet what's amazing is that by choosing to understand it, and this is a really interesting thing because you still have to choose truth. You can't just make stuff up. It doesn't work. It just, right? Like if you're like, oh, well, I'm just going to see this really mean thing as an expression of God. You're like, if you don't connect it, you don't feel it, it won't do anything. You'll just repress, you'll avoid. But if you can actually go in and be like, oh, you care, and then it like pings this, like it pings the universal part where you're like, oh, actually you do care. Often you'll find, you guys have all done this in circles probably, where you touch one of those things in you via someone else, and you do feel it deeper than they do. They don't have access to it yet, even though it connects. Like maybe it's like wonder, David has so familiar with wonder, and I've just got this tiny little sliver, in this diagram. And so when he recognizes that over there, boom, it takes him deep in. And it's very hard for me to go deep in. So it's maybe same with this kind of guy that likes to shame liberals. Yes, they deeply care, but it's hard for them to access it because they're not as familiar or comfortable in the care. And that's the other thing that will happen as you kind of embrace more energies in the whole, which includes you and others. You start to find you can embrace more of that wholeness. So like, oh yeah, now that I've been vulnerable in love, like I know how to be in the vulnerable state of caring about the people that I supposedly, shame all the time or whatever. And I can recognize that. It's much easier for me to allow the whole expression to come forward. And that's what happens where it looks like sometimes you've all done this and you've all seen like skilled circlers seem to go very fast into like very deep places. It's like they've built the ladder down into the well. Or they've, in a very literal sense, they've probably built the neural pathway that allows them, they've done the steps, they've done the work through time to get from like, I'm angry to I'm a rebel to I care to, but like life matters to me, truth matters to me. And I'm afraid if I don't do this, then I'm going to lose all meaning or whatever it is, whatever deep core thing. And then beyond that, it's like they can go straight there because they've built that pathway. And again, you guys have done this. You've all done this. Which does give us a chance to bring it back around to difficult conversations. So I think one of the things that happens in conversations that become difficult is that obviously one thing that happens is we kind of contract around this and we try to do that. We try to cut it off. I'm this, you're that. And I think part of the reason it gets difficult is because it's just not true. And whenever you resist the truth, it hurts. You try to create a fake separation and it kind of, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't jive. Looks like a Texas cowboy hat. Amen. Of course, because I'm here in Texas. Yeah, it's like, it's one hat. You can't just cut off a side and still call it a cowboy hat. It's nice. It's really confusing. If you only see one piece, you're like, what's the point of this weird piece of palm frond or leather, whatever the hell the hat's made out of, But then you see the whole and you're like, this totally makes sense now. So yeah, one thing that happens is in these difficult conversations is we just do this and we do it and it's okay. And you will all recognize it. When you get into a tough conversation, you're going to find yourself doing that. Fuck you. I'm different from you. And so one thing that can help is by starting to like soften that contraction. And so softening it could be through empathy, through, doing what we do in circling, where we're like, let me see if I can find myself in them. You can also soften that through softening around your contraction. Like, hey, I'm not okay right now. I need help. I don't have enough resources to do this conversation. You don't make yourself wrong for not being available when you're not. Because what happens when you do that is now you're starting to own your experience. You're starting to claim your experience. If you say, hey, I'm not available for this, you're not making it about them anymore. It's not you're too much. You're not understanding me. It's, hey, I don't have the capacity for this right now. I need a break. I need a little help. Yeah. Another thing I think, yeah, I think this is really important. Another thing that happens with like conversations that are difficult is we assume we need to resolve them, right? We even have these terms, conflict resolution. And it's like we come into conflict assuming that it should be resolved. So, I don't know, how often do you question that? So circling has a very different, and we do this amongst our parts too, right? If we use the parts frame, we're like, oh God, there's these different parts that think different things, they're in conflict. And so I need to bring them into dialogue and resolve the conflict, you know? But when we have this frame that's more like, you know, the pre-differentiated version, you can see that like it's not that conflict needs to be solved. It's rather, I'm struggling to find the theory right now, and I want to pause for a moment to find it, but I can just say pragmatically what it is just what's actually true here. So what it becomes is conflict's not something to be resolved or solved, but it's something to engage. It's something to learn through. It's often a generator of diversity, of creativity, of newness, of freshness, of third way. You know, we often are, it's either this way or that way, and we bring that conflict in and we think we have to resolve it. Someone's going to get their way, and what pops out is a fourth way, a fifth way, something we hadn't foreseen in the past if we wouldn't have let the conflict kind of heat up a little, right? There's alchemy in the heat. There's cooking. Throw a bunch of ingredients in a pan and then eat them, and it might taste pretty good, but the market for baked goods is much higher than the market for unbaked baked goods.
It depends on whether we're talking about cookie dough or not, though.
Oh, no, I was thinking about that. What do you think, though? You think there are more cookies in the world or more cookie dough in the world?
I think cookie dough is more desirable because people tell us it's more dangerous because of the uncooked eggs. Therefore, it's more yummy. Like I had this conversation with my roommate. She's like, I like the cookie dough that says it's not meant to be eaten versus the cookie dough that's like ready to eat cookie dough. Right. She's like, there's a taste difference. I just know it.
Well, fair enough. You know, some of us are like, we're all into that cookie dough. And it's kind of cool because, yeah, all cookies at one point in their lives were cookie doughs, right? Like, I guess technically, you know, cookie dough is just for sure more prevalent. But I think most people consume way more cookies than they consume cookie doughs. I don't know why I use that in the plural. I've never tried that. Cookie doughs. Nosy dough.
Nosy dough.
More Texas, yeah. Yeah, so there's something really powerful to bring a circling frame. I've done actually a lot of like conflict circling. I don't know what else to call it. And something that can happen really, really, really powerful. One thing that can really like make things go in a unique, new, fresh, creative direction for something that seemed like it was completely intractable is by from the get-go being like, hey, I'm not here to resolve this conflict. I don't know if we can solve anything. I know that I'm here, I can bring more truth to what's happening. And we're going to unveil more of what's unsaid, unseen, unspoken. We can do that for sure. But it might actually make the conflict worse. If that's your point of view, that conflict is bad.
It's like a dance.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just a dance. And to me, there's not necessarily some goal to it. Like you know, because you might have a dance. I mean, even literally dancing, you might be having a dance with someone, and it might jive and flow and feel beautiful, and it totally might not, and for no reason or fault of anybody's. And there doesn't have to be a goal for that to happen. I don't know. It just was my analogy.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And when you see it that way, when you can hold it that way, you can really enjoy the dance in a way that it's hard otherwise. Yeah. You know, it's hard if you're moving your body in really awkward ways with somebody and not calling it dance. It's probably going to be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's something like, so I think that can be really helpful. And another thing that's interesting about this is that for me, a lot of times in like having difficult conversations, like if I'm in the role of facilitator, like there's an assumption that like we should somehow be neutral. And I don't find that very helpful. I mean, to a certain extent, like, yes, you're there to bring the truth out and not necessarily to, resolve things. So in that sense, you're neutral, you're here for the truth. But in the typical circling fashion, like, I'm a person and I have feelings and thoughts and desires. And I find that it just goes better if I'm in a conversation to be honest that I'm in the conversation. Like, hey, I have preferences here, and to own it when it comes up, like good circling, where I'm like, hey, I was in a neutral stance and now I'm like really wanting you to understand what this person's saying because it's super frustrating to me that you don't, or whatever the hell it is that's going on in me. And what's interesting is that then this kind of plays into this whole deal, because what often ends up happening is you kind of, if you have the space for it, the energy will often move to the person that's like most available to it, So like if I'm able to kind of hold myself from that like larger witnessing awareness and be like, oh, suddenly I want this conversation to go somewhere and resolve it, and can own that and share it without needing it to happen. Often it's something this person was feeling and unable to name and own in the conversation. And so this understanding helps us. It's not like, oh, my part, my little individual guy that needs to be seen is now activated, and I have to kind of do my work to help. I need to go talk to my therapist to resolve my need to be seen before I come back and finish this difficult conversation. No, rather it's like, oh, I'm touching into that universe, my unique version of the universal energy of needing to be seen. And so if I'm able to bring this into the connection, and share it, it's going to change the way that this orchestra plays. That doesn't obviously mean that you just willy-nilly go sharing every feeling that you have in a conversation. There's a great deal of attunement and a great deal of capacity to hold yourself and witness and all of that really helps this go well. So all of that we practice in circling, right? We practice that ability to both disidentify with any particular feeling and be in relationship, be much more in the present, and the ability to embody it more, to step into it. I'm 0% threatened by feeling small and afraid. And so I'm free to feel small and afraid and bring it into the connection. And if I am threatened by feeling small and afraid, I learn to be not threatened by being threatened, and I bring that into the connection. So to kind of go through this again, like if you're in this kind of like, oh, I'm just a coherent self, and you're in a difficult conversation, it's going to be very hard for you to change and update, right? Because you're like one thing. It's like updating I don't know, like remodeling a house or something. It's going to take a lot of effort and planning and all this kind of stuff. And so being able to be multitudes, being a choir, having parts, allows you to get a little bit more complexity, maturity, awareness into the conversation. It's difficult. You allow more of the truth to come out because you can allow more being, and there's more capacity to change, to update, to be influenced by each other. And then if you're able to then move it more to like an orchestra, then you have even more capacity to be with the crunch, the difficulty of the thing, because you don't need everything to be equal anymore. You can say, I have preferences. You know, it's kind of an integration of these two in a way, this orchestra. I have a coherent orchestra with preferences, with betters and worses. And I'm assuming you have betters and worses too. Even if all you do is relate to it as a bunch of parts that are equal, it sounds like you prefer that to not that. And you think that's better than not that. So we can rely on, yes, we agree there are sometimes betters and worses, and that's what we're navigating here. And then if you can take it again to this limnescate, the infinity sign, you can feel that there's even more freedom and of movement, of change in this, and finally into this more unique universal where you are actually, the thing that you are is simply a kind of empty set pointing at movement, at change, at process, at the bubbling forth of this aquifer of divinity, of consciousness expressed very uniquely through your character. And when you can be that, you can inhabit the wholeness of the conflict. And you can not inhabit, you can allow yourself to be one pole and someone else to be another pole and someone else to be a third pole that you didn't even realize was a third way of seeing the thing. And then you can allow like life to hold the wholeness and be aware of it. You've seen, you've been in circles. So there's this amazing movement, allowance of change, of light to be shown upon what's really going on. And then we can offer that essentially in our, like this also can explain some of those things where like spontaneously someone in a group has an insight and everyone else has a similar insight. There's it almost can explain like transmissions. If I get into a flow and I'm feeling this crazy love transmission and you come off the call feeling that love as well, it's like, yeah, like that's, you know, that very, I've always shied away from the terms like vibrations. It's so easy to talk about it like in such a hippie way, but it kind of makes sense if you think of these different colors as, it's not like, oh, I vibrate and then there's this like vibe, and it's like there's the particular vibration of protective mother, and when I vibe in it, I'm like sounding that energy into the whole world, and it awakens that in everyone else. So if I vibe in like this love transmission, if I'm sounding that note, it's one note that then gets sounded in everyone, a frequency. Exactly. Yeah. And so the other sprouts respond to that sounding of that note.
The analogy of the ocean, where the water works for that too.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant.
Mm-hmm. It boils down to me to two words. It's just magic and mystery.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you can hold that simplicity of like magic and mystery, you're golden anywhere, anytime, right? No matter what's happening. Even if you're like, I'm hating what's happening, you're like, oh, let me see if I can hold my hatred with magic and mystery.
For me, the two words that are responses to your two words are compassion and curiosity. So when I encounter magic and mystery, I'm focused on curiosity and compassion about what I discover and experience.
Mm-hmm.
And that includes you.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be one of the real gifts of the kind of a parts mentality, is you can get curious and compassionate towards energies inside of you that you haven't noticed before. really, really holding that as like, oh, there's stuff in me that I'm not aware of. There's these, whether you call it parts or energies or unique universals or vibrations, being able to come with a sense of open arms can really transform your experience.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if there's enough time to delve into this, but where do you fit the word mind in with all of this? Because, you know, that word, boy, it can be used, and I know that might be a whole night's talk. And maybe you've already talked, I mean, I know you've probably fitted in other talks, but I don't know if you've ever devoted a night to that, you know, but just, I find that fascinating. Like mind can be thought of as consciousness.
Yeah.
But then is mind the human thought part of it? Or I don't know.
I think it's super complex. It's a very, very good question. It's super important too, because we've all had the experience of like, if I was sitting here just giving my mind out to you guys, you wouldn't come, right? You'd be like, I can go attend a lecture at college or on YouTube, like,
yeah,
and learn something. Like if I want to go learn something mindy, I don't want to come to this thing where this guy's like kind of discovering in the moment all this stuff and like, you know, saying these really fuzzy things, right? Like you just lose interest. Even a really good lecture, you'd have to like effort, like a really good lecture will be more than just the mind, right? So we've all been in a circle where somebody goes off into their like just their mental rational analysis, or in a conversation if you're not circling, and you're like, man, I just completely lost connection with this person. Mm-hmm. And the more you practice being aware, the more you'll recognize it. Oh, interesting, they lost presence. At the same time, I don't know about you guys, but since I've been around circling for many years, I've seen a lot of people that have done efforts to get rid of the mind. And I have a very hard time having meaningful connection with them. You know, there's a huge part of my being and their being that they're basically being dishonest about, because don't use the mind is a mental construct. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, I have to tiptoe around like what I actually think is one of the most incredible creations of evolution to date. You know, this capacity for self-reflection and meaning making that is so fucking unreal. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I think it's a very complex topic, and maybe we should talk about it next week. But one thing to add would be that it is kind of cool if you think of it as like what happens when you think of mind as it's another one of these energies. Like instead of wonder, you know, what if mind or mentalness is one of the things that shows up? And so instead of thinking of mind as like this particular thing that fits onto my mind, my thoughts, my rationalization, it's much more like there's a lineage in the planets, in human history, that's called mind. And we're all inheriting and enacting this lineage at different times in different ways. It's pretty cool.
That's, yeah, we could chew on that. Mm-hmm.
And yeah, then the bonus is again that you often, when you see someone else go into their mind, you can be like, oh shit, this is beautiful. Even when you're like, I want something more. But usually the result then is that you'll like, pre-thinking this way, you'll be like, you're so in your head. What do you feel in your body? You know, post-thinking this way, you're like, wow, thank you. How is it to say that with me? Mm-hmm. Or, wow, I feel so open. Or the opposite, wow, I feel so angry when I hear you talk. Do you feel angry?
Mm.
I hear that as more access points.
More access points, yeah.
I've loved your energy this whole hour.
Thank you.
Like, it's been great.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Really interesting, fun talk. You know, it would be another neat topic too to fit in is and especially you as a writer and all the creating and musical creative things you do. But, and I know other people who create have talked about this, but like where does mind fit in with that? So when are you just a vessel or a conduit for consciousness and you're not even creating the thing that comes out? Versus when are you the one who's creating? Because there are times then that you're thinking consciously, intentionally creating, and so you're using your instrument, your mind, in a way, but very often just channeling something that comes from elsewhere, like many great artists or music, will say. And that's just another really fascinating topic. Like, I'd love to know how you wrote your book. Like, did some of that just come through you and you're like, I don't know where that came, or consciously create, or both, just, that's a really cool topic, how it fits in with all of this.
I love it. And always, you guys, if you have good topic ideas, post them on Facebook or ask me, or at the end here like this, ask me before, after, during. I love it. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Tons of love.
Good night, all. Love y'all.
Thank you. Bye.